And for some analysis on this, joining me now live from Kiev is Andreas Umland. He is an analyst at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. So, Donald Trump calls Zelenskyy a dictator, yet his own envoy to Kiev praises Zelenskyy as a courageous leader. So, are we witnessing a complete breakdown of coherent U.S. foreign policy, or is this just political theater?
One hopes that this is just political theater. This talk about Zelensky as a dictator is indeed Russian propaganda topos, and it's based on the fact that indeed there are no elections now in Ukraine, but that is because there's martial law in Ukraine and in other countries which were in war, let's say Britain in World War I and World War II, and Britain was not even occupied, also did not have elections. So this is a way of blaming the victim and also making Ukraine responsible for the war, which very much corresponds to the Russian propaganda.
And now, Andreas, with the Kremlin signaling a possible Donald Trump-Putin meeting and the U.S. opposing language calling Russia the aggressor in the G7 statement, is the U.S. slowly pivoting towards a more Russia-friendly stance? And what would that mean for Ukraine and, in particular, the war in Ukraine?
If the rhetoric becomes then indeed material and is implemented, then this is very worrisome. If it's just, as you said, theater, then perhaps maybe that is not so consequential, and then we should perhaps wait for what comes actually out of it. But if that all then ends in a deal in which Ukraine loses territory, loses sovereignty, the US gets some rare earth there, this would all be very bizarre, because you would then have nuclear weapon states, Russia and North Korea on the other side, and the US as well, that are sort of dividing Ukraine among themselves, and which is a non-nuclear weapon state. And that would be, I would say, the end of the sort of post-war order, because then many countries around the world will want to get weapons of mass destruction to prevent something like that happening to themselves.
Right. And Andreas, Zelensky says his meeting with Donald Trump's envoy restores hope. But how much real influence does Keith Kellogg actually have? Is this just a symbolic gesture to keep Ukraine in the game, or does it signal a shift in Donald Trump's potential approach?
Well, that would be to ask somebody in Washington who knows, what the influence of the different advisors and people around Trump is. Kellogg is officially responsible, so to say, for Ukraine. He's therefore also for the Ukrainian president an important person. But what eventually influence he will have on Trump is open to question. My impression from Kellogg is that he has actually a very good understanding of this war and of Ukraine's situation. He has been to Ukraine before. He has also been in the east of Ukraine. He has seen also the war-ravaged cities of Ukraine. So he is very competent. And when he was named the responsible person for Ukraine, Kiev liked this nomination of him. But now the question is what kind of influence he will have in Washington on the decisions to be made there.
Right. Now, Andreas, of course, the rhetoric we are seeing come from the White House right now is very aggressive towards Ukraine. Let me ask you, if Ukraine is forced into agreeing to a ceasefire deal that has been agreed upon by Russia and the United States, and a deal which involves Ukraine formally accepting Russian annexation of territories like Crimea, if such a thing happens, what kind of message do you think it is going to send to the international community? And more importantly, what precedent is it going to set for Russia?
As I already mentioned, this would be very destructive for the international system, because we have the UN, United Nations, we have the non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons, we have conventions on biological weapons and on chemical weapons. And Ukraine is even more protected, supposedly, by the so-called Budapest Memorandum, which was a special document signed by the depositary states of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And if now Ukraine comes out as a loser of this war against the a country that has guaranteed Ukrainian security in 1994, and if Russia is perhaps even assisted then in a certain way by the United States, which also has given security assurances to Ukraine in 1994, this will create a lot of distrust in the world and will then motivate countries around the world to not trust in international law and international organizations and international solidarity anymore, and instead to try to get weapons of mass destruction to prevent a fate for their own countries like that of Ukraine.
Andreas Umland, thanks very much for joining me here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time.